The biting wind that whipped through the narrow streets of Nantes carried more than just the scent of the Loire and damp stone. It carried a chill that settled deep in Louis's bones, a cold hand of fear that seemed to grip the entire city. The laughter that once spilled from taverns was now muted, if present at all, and even the street vendors spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously from side to side. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret, every creaking shutter a warning. Louis pulled his threadbare coat tighter, the wool offering little defense against the pervasive dread. From his small window, overlooking the cobbled square, Louis watched the soldiers. They were everywhere now, their tricorn hats casting ominous shapes against the grey sky, their muskets glinting. They patrolled in rigid formations, their boots striking the stones with a rhythmic, unforgiving beat. He couldn't quite grasp the concept of justice, Aunt Marie tried to explain, nor the new laws that seemed to shift with the wind. All he understood was that the world had changed, becoming a place where familiar faces sometimes vanished, and the slightest misstep could lead to an unknown fate. He saw the stern faces of the officers, their mouths set in hard lines, and wondered what they thought about as they marched, their expressions unreadable, like stone gargoyles come to life. Aunt Marie bustled about their small apartment, her movements quick and efficient, but Louis noticed the tremor in her hands as she kneaded dough for their meager bread. Her usual cheerful hum had been replaced by a quiet, strained silence. He heard snippets of hushed conversations between her and Madame Dubois, the baker's wife, their voices low and urgent. He tried to piece together the fragments, words like arrested and taille, treason, floating through the air like dangerous sparks. Later that evening, as the last vestiges of daylight faded, and a single candle flickered on their table, casting dancing shadows, Aunt Marie sat beside him, her hand gently stroking his hair. Her eyes, usually so bright, were clouded with a deep sorrow. "Louis, my little one," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Monsieur Dubois, he was taken today." Louis's stomach clenched. Monsieur Dubois, the kind baker who always slipped him a warm roll and a smile, the man who smelled of flour and yeast and comforting warmth, was gone. "Why, Aunt Marie?" he asked, his voice small, fragile. "What did he do?" Aunt Marie sighed, a sound heavy with exhaustion and grief. "He spoke his mind, Louis. He questioned the new ways, the changes. He missed the old days, just like many of us." Her gaze drifted to the window, to the dark streets below. "They said he was an enemy of the people, a counter-revolutionary." She squeezed his hand. "You must be careful, Louis. You must watch what you say, what you even think. The walls have ears now, and the whispers of Nantes can be deadly." The image of Monsieur Dubois' gentle face, now gone, haunted Louis. The city outside, once a vibrant tapestry of life, now felt like a cage, its bars fashioned from fear and suspicion. He could almost hear the whispers themselves, slithering through the cracks in the stones, weaving a web of dread around them all. The crisp morning air usually carried the scent of baking bread and river damp, but today, a new scent mingled with it: fear. A bulletin, freshly tacked to the town square's notice board, rippled in the breeze, drawing a small, hushed crowd. Louis, clutching Aunt Marie's hand, craned his neck to read the bold script. "Citizens of Nantes," it began. "Effective immediately, all persons are required to display a tricolour ribbon prominently on their outermost garment. Compliance is mandatory. Failure to adhere will be considered an act of defiance against the Republic." Aunt Marie's grip tightened, her knuckles white. "More eyes, Louis," she murmured, her voice a dry whisper. "Always more eyes." The ribbons at first seemed a trivial matter. Just a strip of cloth, red, white, and blue. But Louis quickly understood it was another thread in the Republic's ever-tightening net. The very next day, walking to the market, he saw it. A woman, her worn shawl lacking the mandatory decoration, was stopped by two National Guardsmen. Her face, etched with fatigue, paled as one of the guards pointed a finger at her chest, his voice a harsh bark. She fumbled with her basket, tears welling in her eyes, until another woman, quick thinking, untied her own ribbon and discreetly passed it over. The guards, satisfied, eventually moved on, leaving the first woman trembling, her market purchases forgotten. Louis felt a prickle of shame, not for the woman, but for the ease with which such power was wielded. That evening, As Aunt Marie stirred a thin soup, her usual cheerful humming was absent. The silence in their small cottage was thick with unspoken anxieties. "They're talking, Louis," she said, her voice barely audible above the crackle of the hearth. "Down by the docks. Whispers of something new on the Loire." Louis looked up, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "What kind of something?" She hesitated, her gaze fixed on the simmering pot. "Floating prisons, they say. Barges, packed with people. Taken out to the river, and then—" She trailed off, a shudder running through her. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Louis had heard hushed mentions of arrests, of crowded jails, but this was different. The river, which had always been a symbol of life and trade, suddenly felt menacing. He pictured the wide, dark expanse of the Loire, the swift current, and the thought of people trapped on a barge, drifting towards an unknown horror, made his stomach clench. Aunt Marie quickly changed the subject, her tone forcedly bright. "Enough of such talk. Finish your soup, my dear. We have much to do tomorrow." But the casualness didn't quite cover the tremor in her hands as she ladled out his portion. The ribbons, Louis realized, were just the beginning. The river held a darker secret, and the fear that now permeated every corner of Nantes was only just finding its true, terrifying voice. The crisp morning air, usually a balm, felt like a slap. Louis, sent to fetch water from the well, froze mid-stride, the empty bucket slipping from his grasp with a dull clatter. Down the cobbled lane, a small procession moved with a chilling, methodical pace. At its center, Madame Duval, her silver hair disheveled, her usually vibrant blue dress now a crumpled greyish-blue shadow, was being propelled forward by two uniformed men. Their muskets, gleaming dully in the weak sunlight, seemed impossibly large against her frail figure. Her hands, bound loosely, trembled slightly. Her eyes, usually so keen and full of a mischievous twinkle, were wide with a terror that clawed at Louis's own throat. He took a step, a wordless cry forming on his lips, a childish instinct to help, to intervene. But a firm, unyielding hand clamped onto his shoulder, pulling him back into the shadows of the bakery's awning. Aunt Marie, her face a mask of grim determination, pressed a finger to her lips, her eyes, usually soft, now hard and watchful. She held him tight, an iron grip that spoke more of necessity than comfort. Louis struggled, a silent plea in his wide eyes, but Aunt Marie shook her head, a barely perceptible movement that conveyed an absolute refusal. He watched, helpless, as Madame Duval stumbled, caught herself, and then was urged onward. Her gaze, for a fleeting moment, swept over their hiding place, a flicker of something unreadable passing through her eyes. Recognition? Resignation? Then she was gone, swallowed by the turn in the lane that led inevitably to the river. The Loire. Once, it had been a source of endless fascination for Louis, a place of playful skipping stones and sun-dappled reflections. Now, the very thought of it sent a shiver down his spine. The broad, shimmering expanse had become a gaping maw, a silent, hungry entity. Its gentle murmur no longer soothed. It whispered of cold, dark depths. The barges, once symbols of commerce and connection, now seemed like ominous, waiting hulks. A profound quiet settled over the town, a heavy blanket woven from fear and unspoken grief. The birds, usually raucous, were silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Aunt Marie finally released him, her hand moving to cup the back of his head, pulling him gently against her apron. He buried his face in the worn fabric, the scent of flour and faint lavender, a small, fleeting comfort against the stark, cold dread that had taken root in his heart. The river, he knew, would never be the same again. The scent of beeswax and old paper hung heavy in the air as Aunt Marie knelt, her movements precise and deliberate. Dust motes danced in the sliver of afternoon light, cutting through the shuttered window, illuminating her intent face. With a small, flat pry bar, she carefully worked at a loose floorboard near the hearth, the wood groaning softly in protest. Louis watched, perched on a stool, his heart thrumming a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He'd learned that Aunt Marie's quiet intensity usually heralded something important, often something secret. Finally, the board lifted, revealing a shallow cavity in the earth beneath. Aunt Marie reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound book, its cover worn smooth from countless readings. It was the family Bible, its pages filled with generations of births, deaths, and handwritten prayers. Louis had seen it many times, usually on Sundays, but never treated with such hushed reverence. "This, Louis," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackle of the fire, "is a treasure. More precious than gold, more vital than bread." She tucked the Bible into the hollow, then covered it with a piece of old linen, before carefully replacing the floorboard. The faint click as it settled back into place seemed to echo the finality of her action. She turned to him. Her eyes, usually so warm, now held a glint of fear he hadn't seen before. "You must never speak of this. Not to anyone. Not a soul, do you understand?" Louis nodded, his throat tight. He understood secrecy, the hushed conversations, the quick glances exchanged between adults. But this felt different, heavier. "Why, Aunt Marie? Why hide it?" She sighed, a weary sound that seemed to pull at the very fabric of her being. "Because, my little one, they want to take it from us. They want to take away our beliefs, our prayers, our very God." She stroked his hair, her touch a comforting anchor in a suddenly disorienting world. "They want to make us forget who we are, where we come from. But this book—" She gestured vaguely towards the floor. "It reminds us. It keeps our faith alive, even when the world outside tries to snuff it out." Louis furrowed his brow, trying to grasp the enormity of her words. Beliefs. Taken away. It was an abstract, terrifying concept, like trying to imagine the sky without stars. How could someone steal what was inside your heart? He thought of the priests, driven from their parishes, of the empty churches now used for godless festivals. He remembered the old widow Dubois, her rosary snatched from her trembling hands by a zealous guard, her cries echoing long after the man had disappeared. The revolution, he was beginning to understand, wasn't just about new laws or new leaders. It was about severing the very roots of their existence, leaving them adrift in a sea of fear and uncertainty. The Bible under the floorboards wasn't just a book. It was a desperate defiance, a fragile ember against a gathering storm. The oppressive heat of the summer night clung to Louis, even in the small, airless attic room. He stirred, not from the warmth but from a growing, flickering orange light that painted the rough wooden beams above him. It pulsed, a silent heartbeat against the otherwise impenetrable dark. He rubbed his eyes, thinking it a dream, but the light intensified, casting dancing shadows of their meager belongings across the sloped ceiling. He scrambled from his pallet, the floorboards groaning beneath his bare feet. A terrible premonition tightened in his chest. He padded to the single grimy window, pushing aside the tattered cloth that served as a curtain. The sight that greeted him stole the breath from his lungs. Across the rolling dark fields, a series of enormous angry bonfires raged. They weren't campfires, nor the distant glow of a blacksmith's forge. These were immense, consuming infernos, devouring entire structures. Flames licked high into the inky sky, spitting embers like malevolent stars. "Aunt Marie," he whispered, his voice a choked sound. A rustle from the corner indicated she was already awake. She was at the window beside him in a moment, her usually placid face etched with a grim understanding. Her arm went around his shoulders, pulling him close, her touch a fragile comfort against the terror burgeoning within him. "What is it?" he dared to ask, the heat from the distant conflagrations seeming to reach them even here. Her gaze was fixed on the furthest blaze, a particularly vibrant orange that seemed to devour the night itself. "Those are houses, Louis, the homes of those who fled. They're burning them to the ground." Her voice was low, devoid of its usual lilt, a flat statement of fact that only amplified the horror. Louis watched, mesmerized and horrified. He could almost hear the crackling, the splintering of wood, the roar of the fire. The thought of familiar rooms, kitchens where meals were shared, beds where families slept, all consumed by this ravenous beast, was unbearable. It wasn't just wood and stone. It was memories, lives, futures, turning to ash. This wasn't merely destruction, it was an act of erasure, a brutal declaration that some people, and everything they owned, simply ceased to matter. Aunt Marie sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of all their unspoken fears. They want to leave nothing behind. No trace. Her fingers tightened on his shoulder, a silent warning to remember, even as the world around them sought to forget through fire. The orange glow pulsed, a relentless burning eye in the distance, a stark symbol of the revolution's merciless appetite. Louis felt a profound helplessness, a child watching the world he knew being systematically immolated, piece by agonizing piece. The air, though still, seemed to vibrate with the silent screams of the burning. The familiar clatter of hooves on Nantes, cobblestones, once a calming pulse, now hammered, a new, discordant rhythm. Louis, peering through the worn linen curtain, saw them. Not just the usual patrols, but a dense, suffocating wave of blue-clad soldiers, muskets glinting like 1,000 frozen eyes. A stark, severe banner, a chilling antidote to the cherished fleur-de-lis, flapped from the Hôtel de Ville. "Carrier," Aunt Marie whispered, her voice a dry rustle of autumn leaves. "He has arrived." The name, heavy and cold as a premonition of winter, hung in the summer air. Louis shivered. The streets, already taut with unease, now throbbed with a palpable, almost suffocating fear. Carts, larger and far more numerous, rumbled past their window with a chilling regularity. They weren't laden with market goods or firewood, but with people, men, women, even children, their faces etched with a silent terror that mirrored their captors' grim expressions. Each passing cart was a fresh stab of ice in Louis's chest. He yearned to look away, to bury his face in Aunt Marie's skirt, but a morbid curiosity, a desperate need to comprehend this new horror, riveted his gaze. Aunt Marie gently drew him from the window, her hands, usually so warm and steady, trembling slightly as she pulled the curtain fully closed, plunging their small room into premature twilight. "We stay inside, Louis?" she murmured, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for an invisible threat. "No more walks to the river. No more trips to the baker for now." The river, their haven of quiet solace, now felt tainted. The baker, where they had once exchanged small, defiant smiles with neighbors, was now a place to be avoided. Louis hugged his worn wooden soldier, its paint chipped, but its spirit unyielding. "Why, Aunt Marie, why are they taking everyone?" His voice was a small, fragile whisper against the rising tide of dread. He remembered tales of old, of kings and queens, of feasts and festivals. Now, it felt as though the world had inverted, darkness, swallowing the light. There seemed no sanctuary left, not even within the familiar walls of their home, which now seemed to shrink around them, a fragile shell against a crushing force. Aunt Marie smoothed his hair, a silent prayer forming on her lips. Her eyes held a deep, unyielding sorrow, but her grip on his shoulder was firm. "We will be strong, Louis," she said, her voice a low, steady hum. "We will endure." Yet even as she spoke, the distant cries from the street intensified, a stark reminder of the fragile hope in her words. The scent of damp earth and wood smoke clung to the air, a familiar perfume of the city, but today it carried a faint, metallic undertone that prickled at Louis's nose. He was supposedly helping Aunt Marie gather fallen branches for their meager fire, but his eyes kept straying to the soldiers congregating near the river's edge. Their voices, usually a dull rumble, were sharper, punctuated by harsh laughter. Aunt Marie, her back to the river, meticulously snapped twigs, her movements precise and unhurried, as if to calm the frantic beat of Louis's heart. "Burn them out, I say," a gruff voice echoed, cutting through the general din. Louis froze, a branch clutched in his small hand. He strained to hear, pretending to adjust a loose bootlace. "Aye, the cleansing fires will do the trick," another chimed in, a chilling lightness in his tone. Too many rebellious villages, too much defiance. Louis felt a cold dread unfurl in his stomach, not just individuals now, not just the unlucky few caught in the net of suspicion. Villages. The word conjured images of the small, close-knit communities he'd passed through on their journey to Nantes, their stone cottages and thatched roofs. He pictured the flickering glow of those cleansing fires, not merely singeing but consuming. The idea was too vast, too terrifying to fully grasp, yet the image seared itself into his mind. Entire homes engulfed, People scattered, lost. He glanced at Aunt Marie. Her shoulders were rigid, her hands momentarily still. She had heard too, her expression a careful mask of indifference. But Louis knew her too well. A faint tremor ran through her arm as she resumed, snapping a branch, a tiny, almost imperceptible quiver that spoke volumes. The metallic tang in the air suddenly felt more potent, like the scent of old blood. Later, huddled by their sputtering fire, the darkness pressing in, Aunt Marie's voice was a low murmur. "Louis, we cannot stay." Her gaze was fixed on the shifting embers, mirroring the anxious dance in her eyes. "It's no longer safe, not with what they plan." Louis nodded, the words he'd overheard still echoing. The cleansing fires and rebellious villages had solidified a terrifying truth. The danger had metastasized, spreading beyond individual arrests to engulf entire communities. Nantes, once a refuge, now felt like a cage with bars forged from fear. "Where will we go?" he whispered, his voice small in the vast, intimidating night. Aunt Marie reached out, her calloused hand finding his, squeezing it with a fierce tenderness. "North, perhaps. Away from the river. Away from this." Her voice cracked, betraying the strain beneath her usual resolve. "We must leave before dawn. There's no other way." Quote, the moon, a sliver of bone, barely pierced the gloom as Aunt Marie urged Louis from their small house. He clung to his worn wooden soldier, its chipped paint a familiar balm against the cold dread seeping into his very marrow. Their belongings were sparse: a single blanket, a handful of stale biscuits, and Marie's diminutive hidden crucifix. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of fear and the distant, acrid scent of recent fires. Every rustle of leaves, every far-off dog's bark, sent a jolt of alarm through the boy. Marie's hand, calloused yet firm, was his lifeline. "Keep your eyes on my back, mon petit, no looking around, just forward." Her voice, a low, determined hum, quieted the frantic drumbeat of his own heart. They moved like wraiths, avoiding main thoroughfares, their boots crunching on gravel paths that snaked through fields stripped bare. The further they distanced themselves from Nantes, the thinner the air seemed to become, each breath a small triumph. Days blurred into nights, marked only by the sun's weary arc across the sky. They found refuge in overgrown thickets, beneath ancient, sprawling oaks, and once, for an entire afternoon, in a forgotten hayloft, the dry stalks, scratching at Louis's skin. He learned to differentiate the distant rumble of carts from the heavier clatter of troop movements, the shrill cry of a hawk from a child's frightened wail. Louis witnessed the skeletal remains of former homes, villages reduced to charcoal and splintered timber. A lone chimney stood sentinel over a pile of ash where a roof had once been. A broken cradle lay askew in a yard choked with weeds. The silence in these places was profound, a heavy shroud woven from absence. He imagined the lives that had once bustled there, the laughter, the arguments, the shared meals, all extinguished with brutal efficiency. A lump formed in his throat, a silent question he dared not voice, but Marie seemed to understand. She would squeeze his hand, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her lips moving in a prayer he couldn't discern. Yet, with each step that carried them further from the river's deadly currents, from the echoes of the noyades and the spectacle of the mariages républicaines, a fragile seedling of hope began to unfurl within Louis. It wasn't a loud, triumphant hope, but a quiet, persistent hum, like the distant buzzing of a bee. Every untouched patch of forest, every stream they safely navigated, became a tiny victory. He imagined a place where the air didn't taste of ash, where people didn't look at him with suspicion or terror. He envisioned a place where Aunt Marie could pray openly, where his wooden soldier could stand guard over a truly safe home. The road was long, fraught with unseen perils, but with each weary footfall, the possibility of a different future beckoned. A faint, shimmering mirage on the horizon. The path, barely more than a deer trail, finally widened into a rutted track, and then, miraculously, into a cobbled road. Louis squinted against the late afternoon sun, his hand finding Aunt Marie's as they crested the final hill. Below them, nestled in a valley carved by a meandering silver river, lay a village. It was small, certainly, with a church steeple that looked somewhat crooked against the sky, but it was undeniably there. Smoke curled lazily from several chimneys, and a distant, rhythmic clang suggested a blacksmith at work. "Look, Louis," Aunt Marie whispered, her voice thick with a relief that made her sound almost like a different person. Her grip on his hand tightened, not in fear, but in something akin to triumph. They descended slowly, the air growing sweeter, with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, a stark contrast to the acrid stench that had clung to their memories for so long. As they entered the village proper, heads turned, but not with suspicion or malice. A woman hanging laundry paused, her eyes soft with curiosity. A man guiding a plough horse offered a small, tentative nod. There was no hurried whispering, no sudden, sharp movements. The air felt lighter, as if a great, invisible weight had been lifted from their shoulders, the moment they crossed the village's unofficial boundary. Aunt Marie approached a small, whitewashed cottage, with a carefully tended garden. An elderly woman, her face a tapestry of fine wrinkles, emerged as they neared. "Good day," Aunt Marie said, her voice surprisingly steady. "We are travelers, seeking a new beginning." The woman's gaze lingered on Louis's pale face, then on Aunt Marie's worn cloak. "You've come far, I think," she said, her voice gentle, without the usual sharp edge Louis had come to expect from strangers. "From the west, by the look of your dust." She didn't press for details, didn't demand papers or declarations. She simply opened her door a little wider. "There's a spare room, if you'd like, and a stew on the fire." Louis felt a tremor of something unfamiliar spread through him. It wasn't fear, nor hunger, though his stomach rumbled. It was a sensation of quiet hope, like the first tentative shoots of spring, after a long, brutal winter. He saw it reflected in Aunt Marie's eyes, a softening around the edges that hadn't been there in months. Later, as he sat by the hearth, watching the flames dance, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer provided a steady, reassuring counterpoint to the chirping crickets outside. It was a sound of creation, of purpose, not destruction. He thought of Nantes, of the river's dark embrace, and the screams that had echoed through the night. The memories were still there, sharp and vivid, but they no longer felt like an immediate threat. Here, in this quiet corner of the world, the fiery immolations, the terrible noyades, felt impossibly distant, like a story told in a forgotten language. He knew they would never truly leave him, but perhaps, here, they could begin to fade, to recede into the shadows of the past, making room for something new. He watched Aunt Marie speaking softly with their host, a faint smile gracing her lips, and for the first time, in what felt like forever, Louis allowed himself to breathe. This wasn't just a stopping point, it felt like a true arrival, a new beginning indeed.